Welcome to the Stop Violence Show. My name is Elena Giacci, and I am a national trainer on anti-domestic and sexual violence issues. Today we're going to be talking about sexual violence. So this is a warning that if you do not want your children to hear this frank and topic discussion, then I would advise you to change the channel or turn it off. I am very fortunate today to have the rape crisis of Central New Mexico represented here with Roxanna Balbuena and Jim Harvey. And Jim's been with the Rape Crisis Center now for a year, but has had 10 years of domestic and sexual violence training experience. So welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
This is a hard topic. This is also, unfortunately, something that is very common in all communities and also communities of color as well. So first, when we first start talking about it, tell me how long Rape Crisis has been here and like a little bit about its history.
Well, Rape Crisis Center has been around now for 43 years. Started on the University of New Mexico campus as a joint project of the Health Sciences Department and the law school. And we operated there for many years until it was determined that being on the university's campus and having that close affiliation with the university would give people outside of the university a pass. Oh, this is obviously something that the university is dealing with and it doesn't pertain to me. So Rape Crisis Center moved, and for the last, I guess it's about 7 years now, Roxanna, we've been at 9741 Candelaria Road, just above Eubank in northeast Albuquerque.
So it has had, and it's one of the oldest rape crisis centers in the nation. I think that's something that we can be really proud of as having that history. But along with the history comes responsibility.
Absolutely.
So does Rape Crisis, you mentioned being at the University of New Mexico campus, but Rape Crisis is not just serving Albuquerque. What's the areas that it does serve?
Rape Crisis Center of Central New Mexico covers a 4-county area. So we are Bernalillo County, Sandoval County, Valencia County, and Torrance County. So we're supposed to have a presence. Funding doesn't always permit us to have that kind of presence in all the other areas. So our strongest relationship is probably our activities here in Bernalillo County, in Sandoval County, and we have a good working relationship with other agencies even down in Valencia.
So when you say that it has like Bernalillo County, Sandoval County, does that mean that you have like an advocate there, or does it mean that the calls that come from there you directly serve? What's the difference?
Well, now you're getting into what I want us to do.
Okay, that'd be great.
Which is great. What we do is we work closely with organizations that exist in those areas. For instance, Sandoval County, which includes the town of Bernalillo and parts of Rio Rancho, has several different organizations, including a sexual assault response team, which is made up of a lot of different organizations and the police department and other first responders out there. So we have representation, you know, with the sexual assault response team, and then relationships with, you know, emergency housing programs in Sandoval County. We do the same in Valencia County. We work with the Valencia County Women's Shelter, which is a huge program and growing, unfortunately, but you know, it's growing to meet that need. So we work closely with them as well. Torrance County, which is probably one of our most rural counties, continues to be one of our biggest challenges, and there's a lot going on there. But we do have a presence through the prison systems, and maybe later on we could talk about the Prison Rape Elimination Act and how that carries us into, you know, all 4 of these counties as well.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I do think that would be definitely something to discuss because when we look at rape, sexual violence, child sexual abuse, we know the vulnerability of communities of color from the economic standpoint, and for our most vulnerable, that being children. And so when we start talking about, I hear the words, things like rape, sexual harassment, sexual violence, sexual assault, molestation. Can we tease those words out a little bit and maybe define them? And Roxanna, I'm going to start with you, if you could help us with that.
Yeah, and we can go into like the general like terms of, or those terms and what they mean to the general public. I just want to start off by saying that like every person, we try to give them or empower them and give them that choice to describe what happened to them and name whatever they think is best for their experience. So some people, for example, that have been sexually assaulted or have been raped, don't prefer to call it rape, but sexual assault or something else. So we really want to empower people to decide what they want to call their experience. But for rape, usually we classify it as like penetration, unwanted penetration, or sexual contact. Sexual assault is a general or an umbrella term. So that includes like harassment, rape. So pretty much it's just an umbrella term that covers anything that's not consensual or unwanted or that makes people feel uncomfortable. For molestation, generally it's unwanted touching or something that's not consented in regards to touching. And sexual harassment is like any unwanted advances, and that includes like it could be touching, it could be like catcalling on the street. So every term is really general and means something different, especially for a specific person.
So when we look at, and I really like the idea of allowing that person to define what it is. When we're looking at things like child abuse and how that's very well defined according to our state statute. And when we look at child abuse and we look at things like molestation, are those the same things? Or, you know, because you hear those words kind of intertwined.
Yeah, and I can give you my perspective. Again, we're not like legal advisors or law enforcement, so it can get a little tricky. But from what I have seen personally, they don't necessarily have to go hand in hand. I mean, molestation can be considered like child sexual assault, so can penetration. The laws are very specific as to like the age, but sometimes it gets tricky as to like the specific act of what happened. So even if someone was touched unwantedly, like over the clothes in a place that made a person feel uncomfortable, but didn't have to do with like any genital areas, sometimes that doesn't necessarily fall under a certain law, like child abuse. It might fall under something else. So the legal system is a little tricky, and that's one thing we actually help people try to navigate and understand, because we don't really necessarily understand it completely, just because it changes and is different for a lot of people.
Different statutes, different times. And each year, I know there are a group of advocates and concerned citizens that go up to the state legislature advocating for different changes. I mean, that's how we have gotten to where we are now, because of great legislators, concerned citizens who have really worked hard at trying to make sure that the laws are really up to date. And I think New Mexico can take some, you know, good pats on the back for that. Jim, did you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I think that the legislators here seem to be reaching out and wanting to know what they can do better or differently when it comes to creating legislation that's going to add additional protections, that's going to more clearly define and maybe even narrowly define, you know, certain kinds of things that fall in the realm of sexual assault or child abuse. And you know, and I wanted to say, I'm glad you mentioned child abuse, because you know the national statistic on child abuse is pretty devastating. Every 8 minutes, someplace in this country, Child Protective Services certifies sexual abuse with a child someplace. And unfortunately, New Mexico is no exception to that rule. And you know, and we can name some of the sensational cases that have happened just in recent years here, but it still goes on. And so that's an area that we really want to drill down a lot more. And I've got to say, just recently, some of the child services programs here in Albuquerque received a pretty good chunk of funding to begin to work around child abuse. So we're reaching out to them because a little light bulb went on in my head when I heard about it. And I said, okay, if there's a family where there's an incident or incidents of child abuse, there's also a distinct possibility that there is some adult sexual abuse going on in that same family. And if those agencies that are funded to do to work on child abuse are doing that exclusively, then they need to have a partnership with Rape Crisis Center and begin to, so that we're prepared then to address the adult situations. You know, you've got situations where, you know, a family is dominated by a really aggressive individual. That could be a male or a female, you know, who may be engaged in some really aggressive sexual behavior just within the family. And so when the issue of child abuse comes to the surface, you know, it should force us to take a closer look at what else is going on so that we could hopefully exact a more holistic response.
And I think you bring up a good point, because it's not like child abuse is happening in a capsule all by itself in a family unit. And there are multiple levels, whether it be intimate partner, domestic violence, whether it's multiple levels of sexual abuse and sexual violence happening in a community. And I know one of the things that we talked about years ago was looking at animal abuse along with all of the different violence that's occurring. So it's multiple levels. It doesn't happen because when we look at sexual violence, it's not necessarily about it's when we look at it, people will want to think it's about sex or it's about urges, and instead it's quite the opposite. It has nothing to do with that, and it has everything to do with violence and power.
Power and control.
Power
That's
and
what it
control.
is.
So you had mentioned about like perpetrators. I think a lot of times, especially with sexual violence, they want to think of someone in a trench coat, looking creepy and ugly and oogie and all of that, and that's not so far from the truth. So let's talk a little bit about who those perpetrators are and who is actually doing the perpetration.
Well, for perpetrators, I mean, it's true. The media classifies them as someone like usually a male behind the bush, or usually a stranger. But what we see is that, yes, stranger sexual assaults or sexual assaults perpetrated by strangers do happen, but more than likely it's someone that the person knows, that is friends with, is a family member, so someone that is able to gain the person's trust or put them in a vulnerable situation and take advantage of that. So it's something that we try to change and try to educate the community about, because we want to let people know that if they are sexually assaulted by a friend or a family member, I mean, there's no way that they could have known it was going to happen. And it's never the survivor's fault. And it really could be anybody who could be a perpetrator, just like anybody could be a survivor. Female, male, regardless of age, sexual orientation. It's just really general. It's not one specific
And I
person.
think that's important, because I know that all too often when I would have conversations, especially with fathers, they would say, "Phew, I'm glad I don't have a daughter because, you know, my young man, young boy is safe." And that's not true.
That's
You
not
just brought up an excellent point about male, female, and it happens specifically to males and females almost at the same rate when we're looking at like below the age of 12. And so it's critical not to let the guard down thinking that, well, because I have a young man in my family, that means they're safe or not threatened by sexual violence. And I think completely, Roxanna, that you're very much talking about the bushes, because people want to think that someone who would commit such a horrendous crime obviously is somebody that would be really creepy. We want to think that. And I think that's where juries have a really difficult time. And maybe, you know, you could talk just for a minute about that, Jim, because when people don't, it's like that person, he goes to church regularly, he's a respected member of the community.
Yeah, it's so far from, the mask, the mask that the typical sexual abuser wears, is a mask of familiarity. It really is. This is somebody that we know. This is often an upstanding individual in the community. Or it just could be a father, a stepfather, a mother, a stepmother, an older brother, a cousin, an uncle. It could be any of those, and those are the kinds of cases that we see more often than not. So that person hiding in the bushes, yeah, they're out there, but their numbers are significantly lower than those who hide behind that mask of familiarity, that have that access. You got to have access, and that's what happens. It's an aunt or an uncle says that, well, I'll babysit, and things happen, and so there you have a really interesting shift in what's really going on. I've just got to go back to something that you talked about earlier, Elena, and that is how we express our aggression, in these situations. When I was doing domestic violence work in Chicago, there was an apartment building just a block over from me that at 5 o'clock in the morning went up in flames. We're talking about something like 60 unit apartment building. It went up in flames. And when I went out to check and talk to some of the people, this is how it started. A man had an argument with his lady friend, and she broke up with him. Well, she had just gotten a brand new puppy. He came back and set the puppy on fire, and the flames spread to that apartment and through the rest of the building, and probably 20 families in that building were displaced because of the fire and the water damage. I wanted to go after him for the puppy. I've got 4 dogs and a cat, so that's how I feel about animals. But it's that kind of opportunity and willingness to be aggressive and express that anger, and exert that power over the most innocent beings that you possibly can. In this case, it's a puppy. In another case, it's a child. In another case, it's a young man on a college campus who may be of slight build. It might be, a woman who's walking home from work one night, and she's going down a dark street, and Albuquerque's got lots of dark streets, and he's had his eye on her. He's known her. She's come to a restaurant, and he was a waiter, and he waited on her, or they work in the same office together. It's that power dynamic that presents itself and allows an individual then to express him or herself, in this controlling kind of way that, sadly enough, always manifests itself in sexual abuse.
And I think the point going to, I've been fortunate enough to be in the field of support of our survivors, both domestic and sexual violence, just in a couple of weeks, 28 years. And what we used to see is there would be domestic violence organizations and sexual violence organizations, and they would do the two things, not really understanding the relationship between the two. And you just mentioned this horrific thing that occurred because of an intimate partner relationship that someone may have, and the power and control being exerted over a family, the threats to a family, and everything else. And how often an intimate partner relationship, the dysfunction that person uses is often sexual violence against the person that they are in relationship with. And so all of those levels are critical. When you were talking about perpetrators, and we started mentioning the respected member of the community being, oftentimes this guise, there is a grooming process. There's a grooming process for people in dating relationships, and there's a grooming process for child sexual abuse, because if they look creepy, nobody would ever let them into their family, right?
Exactly.
So they can't look creepy. They have to be, respected members of the community and someone that you would trust your children with. And there's a huge grooming process. Can you talk a little bit about that, as well as just a dating relationship when that happens?
Yeah, and with offenders, one thing that we see is that they're really good at manipulating. They know what they're doing, and from what we know statistically, someone who sexually assaults a person they don't only just do it once for the rest of their life. An offender repeatedly sexually assaults. It could be the same person or different people. So they're really good at doing what they do. They know what they're doing. They manipulate people. They know how to gain people's trust, to look out for people's vulnerabilities. So there's not really a way for a person to prepare for something like this, because sexual assault shouldn't happen. People shouldn't have to be prepared to be sexually assaulted or to react to a sexual assault. And all of this information about perpetrators being anybody, we don't say it to scare people or to give a sense of hopelessness to people, but instead to start the communication process with children or family members or just with friends, and talk about about sexual violence and why it happens, and teach children and family members and friends that it's not the survivor's fault to watch out of perpetrators, but that perpetrators shouldn't be sexually assaulting other people.
And you bring up a good point. I think all too often, and in fact, unfortunately, I think it's the majority of time, people will often blame the victim, even if it's a child, but blame the victim around sexual violence, that somehow the way that they acted caused this to happen, which is completely untrue. And we have to break that piece. And the other component is believing the survivor. And can you talk about the critical nature of what that is believing that person as a family member, as a community member, as a jury member, as understanding the dynamics of what sexual violence is, believing the person.
Well, Roxanna can talk about that a lot better than I can in her role as an advocate. But that's one of the things we lead with when we're having a conversation with a survivor is, we believe you. This is not your fault. And we want to drive those points home, because it's that kind of support and empowerment, that a survivor needs particularly very early, in the stages, the many stages that most of them will go through, after they've been sexually assaulted. And so letting them know that they've got support, letting them know, because you can watch the movies, turn on television, look at the court cases, and look at how, a defense attorney will tear a victim apart on the court stand and make it look like, he or she wanted it, she asked for it, that sort of thing. We want you to know that we are about the antithesis of that, and that is, we believe you.
And that's critical. Roxanne, you were talking, especially as an advocate. That's what advocates do.
Yeah.
First and foremost, that's what advocates do. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, something, again, like Jim said, is that we start by believing. It's really important to believe survivors, because like you said, it's really common that, even in the media or just society in general, it's always of what was this person wearing? How much were they drinking? So it's really victim blaming. It's really putting the responsibility on the survivor, the person who was hurt. Again, when the responsibility should be put on the person who committed the act or committed the crime. So it's really important to believe survivors and to let them know that it wasn't their fault. And after a sexual assault, something that we see and that is really common is that people start questioning themselves because of what they've heard from their families or society, but also because they wish that they could have done something to prevent it. And that's really normal. So if someone has been sexually assaulted and starts questioning their choices or their decisions, their decisions, that's really normal. But we want them to know that it wasn't their fault, and they can always call us and we'll talk to them. And again, we start by believing and supporting them and letting them know that there's nothing that they could have done differently, there's nothing that they did to deserve to be hurt.
And that's so critical to have that kind of support by family, by friends, by community, by coworkers, so that somebody doesn't say, so what were you doing? I know as a survivor and as an advocate, even as an advocate, when this happened and it occurred in my life, I even questioned, it was like, well, maybe if you weren't doing this, or maybe, and I have all of those skills of knowing that it's not my fault, I had nothing to blame myself for, but it doesn't mean that that's not your first kind of instinct of thinking that you have done something. And what everyone can do as a community member, if somebody says, how can I help? It is, you believe this person, your family member, your friend, your coworker, and that in itself, because so often people are put to blame around those issues. When we look at like the statistics, do we know the statistics of like Albuquerque, Bernalillo County specifically? Is that something that we have information on?
So nationally, it's 1 in 4 women will be sexually assaulted in their lives, and 1 in 6 men will be sexually assaulted in their lives. Albuquerque, I don't have the specific statistics, but I know that we are a little bit higher, so it could be 1 in 3 women. So I mean, either way, 1 in 4 and 1 in 6, that's a really big number, and that's just from the people who reported. So imagine all those people that because of the social stigma, they didn't say anything, or they didn't disclose. So that number, I mean, it's higher. It really is. So those are the numbers right now. And really quick, going back to what you said about people blaming themselves, one of the things that does happen, and that I just want to let people know, is that when a sexual assault happens, it's really common for people to freeze when the sexual assault is happening, and that's one of the reasons that people start questioning themselves a lot. Like, I should have fought back, which is what you see in the movies and the commercials and all of that. And it's a natural reaction. It's a reaction of the brain that you're in a dangerous situation, it's scary, this shouldn't be happening, and you just want to stay alive. So it's really common, and most of the time people freeze. So I just want to let people know that it's really common, and it's not their fault, and it's not that they're doing anything wrong. And it's something that we need to educate again people about, because people always ask, well, why didn't you fight back? Why didn't you punch them? Why didn't you run away? But when you're put in that situation, you don't know how you're going to react.
And it's critical because when you talk to survivors, one of the common things is they thought that they were going to die. They were threatened, and they thought, I'm going to die. And women who have families are like, I had to be this way. I had to do this thing because I wanted to live and make sure I could raise my children, or for whatever reason. And even the choice of saying, you know, I am choosing not to do something so that I can live. And that is perfectly okay, and not complicit in what is occurring. So you make a really great point. When we look at those statistics, one of the things that I want to bring up is, as a Native woman, we know our statistics are off the charts, and even more than that. And when we look at more than like a 1 in 3 or less than, when we're looking at, you know, having such a high percentage, and in my viewpoint, we're looking at in my viewpoint, 90% of women who are Native may have suffered some type of sexual violence. And we keep on seeing those kind of statistics, and it makes it more vulnerable, and that piece. When we look at all of those statistics, do you have like how many people you serve a year? Because you had mentioned about the people that you serve.
Yeah, so it changes every day, every week. There's not like a specific timeline that certain people come every day, just because we take hotline calls. We do cases with the sexual assault nurse examiners. So the number does fluctuate, but in average, we take about 250 hotline calls a month, and about 40 cases, sexual assault cases, a month too, in person. And that's, again, an average. Sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower, sometimes the weather changes. It's really unpredictable. But I mean, the average is 250 calls and about 40 cases.
And that's huge.
That's huge.
now talk about, because one of the biggest pieces, and you had mentioned it earlier, Roxanna, is those are those people who have reported. That's big, because when we look at that, what kind of statistics are we looking about? Is like percentage of reports, or how many people report, or like an average? What are we looking at?
I would say less than half of the people report, and again, that's just an average. It really depends, especially depending on the community and what's happening in our society. And I mean, in order to get our services or the services of the sexual assault nurse examiners that we do the cases with, they don't have to report to the police. So again, we give them the choice to get the services and support that they deserve without having to report to law enforcement, but we help them with that option too. So not a lot of people, again, come forward, and sometimes it takes them years to come forward, again, because of the social stigma, their families not supporting them, or them not knowing what to do because no one's ever talked to them about sexual violence and how it's not their fault.
Yeah, one number that's been bounced around here in Albuquerque for some time now is that as few as 1/3 of the sexual assault cases are actually reported.
Right.
And, you know, and again, it goes back to that, you know, that combination of fear and the conspiracy of silence, you know, and all the societal norms that tend to try to push us in a direction of being accepting or at least dismissive of the realities of sexual assault. You know, I was just so delighted when I heard people just unload on Donna Karan, the fashion designer, when she was responding to the Harvey Weinstein situation. And here's a woman who sells sex with her clothes, and she's going to call into question women who dress, quote unquote, provocatively. You know, and say, if they didn't dress like that, well, if they didn't dress like that, Donna, you'd be out of business. You know?
Right.
You'd be out of business. So people just really unloaded on her, and she got quiet very quickly. But those are the kinds of things that you know, we're fighting against on a daily basis. And we have to create these safe spaces and these safe scenarios so that, you know, that mother in a family, for example, who may be witnessing, you know, her young daughter or her young son or both being sexually assaulted by the father of a stepfather, you know, and that's a very common scenario everywhere you go. You know, her refusal to speak forward, to come forward, to take action against this because of the reprisals and the lack of resources, you know, that she may be faced with as a result of that. Those kinds of, we've got to create an environment where people say, no, you know I can speak out, and I know I will be safe, I know I will be taken care of. You know, we just have to do that. Domestic violence work has made some headway in that area, you know, which unfortunately translates a lot of times into shelters, you know. But a shelter is a heck of a lot safer for someone than continuing to live in a particular situation where you're going to be violated over and over and over again and told, you know, you better not say anything, because if you do, these are the consequences, which on face value, you know, seem to be pretty great. You know, so it's that kind of stuff that we have to do, you know, in the sexual assault prevention work, to begin to create safer spaces. And this is where government, where legislators can play a far more effective role. Not just making funds available, but passing laws that will say, yeah, you know, if someone flees or comes forward, you know, to report a sexual assault case, they're going to be protected, they're going to be believed, they're going to be supported, and whoever is guilty is going to be punished to the full extent of the law, and not, well, you go to court, the judge says, okay, I've heard it, be good, get back out there on the street, and you go back out, you do the same thing again. That has to stop.
Right. You had mentioned the Harvey Weinstein component, and it's in, and it probably will be in the news for a very long time, but it is a sexual harassment case, and it talks about sexual harassment. And out of that sexual harassment has come, a lot of people saying, this has occurred to me. Can we talk a minute about, because sexual harassment is still sexual violence.
Yes, it is.
It's on a continuum,
Yes, it
but
is.
it is still sexual violence. So can we talk for a moment about sexual violence and that believability too? I mean, I think, and for me and the people that I know and the women and sisters that I know and the aunties and the grandmas that I know, but even men can be sexually harassed. The idea is that my sisters, I don't know, I can't think of anybody who hasn't been
Exactly.
harassed. So that says how big this is. Can you just talk a little bit and define like the sexual harassment piece, what that is, and the devastating effects? Again, the believability, start by the believing of that person.
Yeah, and I mean with sexual harassment or just sexual violence in general, people have the idea that there has to be like physical contact or there has to be like a gun in someone's head or just really violent. But it doesn't have to be like that, and usually it isn't. Like I said, offenders are really good at manipulating and using that power and control that they have and that they want to exert on other people. So in this case that we're talking about, I've seen a lot of people comment like on articles that, well, because they weren't hurt or because they weren't touched, it wasn't a crime or it wasn't harassment or sexual violence, but it is. Sexual harassment is any like unwanted advances, and it can be verbal, physical, just anything that makes a person feel uncomfortable or makes them feel like they don't have control of a situation and they feel that they are being manipulated. And again, that's what offenders do. And with these actresses and actors that are coming forward, I mean, he was exerting his power and his control to destroy their careers in order for them to do what he was wanting them to do. And again, it doesn't have to be like physical contact, just him exerting that power. It's not okay.
And you make a good point, because people want to think that it's not sexual violence unless someone is hurt. And yet the continuum of hurt is also there as well, as if someone is making advances that you don't want, if someone is talking about your body and you don't want them to talk about parts of your body, if someone is saying, being forward with you and doing those types of things, all of that feels very unsafe, makes you feel very threatened. So all of that piece.
I have a friend who's a banker in the Midwest who called me several months ago because at the time he was an assistant manager at this branch, and the manager of the bank was a woman, and she'd take every opportunity she could to get up close to him, to lean over, to push her breasts against him, to ask him all kinds of deeply personal questions. And finally one day, one of the bank guards told him, you're being sexually assaulted. And he says, what do you mean? He says, all the stuff that makes you feel uncomfortable, that makes you feel icky, that she's doing to you, she's asking questions from other people about, what's your sex life like? Who are you dating? Who are you seen with? She's doing all that because she's trying to set up a scenario for you here. And he finally called me and he says, what do I do? And I just gave him my best advice, and it's one of those success stories because he's got his own branch and she got fired, So there is justice in the world. But I mean, it's that kind of a thing where, the subtleties of sexual harassment, can often be overlooked or mistaken as, they're just being, themselves. They're just being a little familiar. We'll get over it, no harm done. But somebody grabs your butt, you're in a restaurant or a bar, on a bus, if you didn't consent to that, then you're being sexually harassed. And you have every right and, in fact, every obligation to speak up.
And the minimization of that piece is key. Because if we minimize it and say, oh, it's not that bad, it's not that serious, it allows it to continue and it allows it to get worse. A number of times we have talked about different ways of communication to Rape Crisis Center, but one of them is that you have a hotline. Tell me about that hotline. What does it do? Is it 24/7, 365? And what happens if I just wanted to talk to someone?
So we do have a 24/7 hotline open all year, 365 days of the year.
And that number?
It's 505-266-7711. We also have the hotline in Spanish. Es una línea de asistencia. Es el 505-266-7711. Y está abierta las 24 horas al día, 7 días a la semana. So the hotline, people can call and ask questions. They can just talk. They can just rant if they want to, voice their concerns. So we're pretty much there to listen and to help and support them as much as we can. We don't ask for names, ages, if they're like in Valencia County or Albuquerque. So we get calls even from out of state, people calling, wanting confidentiality. And it's completely confidential and anonymous. If people want to say their names, they can, but we never ask for any information.
And if they want to tell their stories, they can. If they want just, and it doesn't necessarily, sometimes the action of sexual violence can be so scary, you can get triggered at any point in time. You may not want to talk about that. You might want to talk about a movie or something that will get your mind off of that. And your advocates are there and understand those types of pieces. So anytime I can call, I can talk to a live person, and and someone will listen and understand and be trained.
Yeah. And yes, every person who answers the phone is trained. We do a 40-hour training, and it's staff and volunteers. And we're also there to give options, because even though we have our own biases and what we think is going to be best for people, we never put that over the hotline or in person. That's just, we keep that at home. Just because everyone reacts differently. Everyone who has been sexually assaulted or has gone through any kind of trauma reacts differently. So we want to give them options and let them decide what they think is going to be best for them, what they think is going to be the best option where they're safe. So we're never there to tell them how to feel or what to do, but just there to listen and support.
So if I have been raped and I call, then give me some ideas of what those the kind of plateful of different options might be, because you just said, I'm not going to say, oh, call the police, or you're going to find out what people are going to do. What are some of those options?
So it can be a little tricky, just because some people might disclose the age, and just like we know legally, sometimes we do have to report, like if a person is under 13 or sexually assaulted by someone in a position of power. But pretty much if someone has been sexually assaulted, we give them the number to the sexual assault nurse examiners. We let them know what the legal system looks like, and that we can be there to support them throughout the whole process. We can do safety plans with them. We can offer them counseling through our counseling services, or if they want outside counseling.
Is there a charge for that?
No, it's completely free. All our services are completely free and confidential. And they're, again, Spanish and English for the hotline. Counseling right now through our organization is only in English, but we're collaborating with Casa Fortaleza, and they do counseling in Spanish for sexual assault survivors. So we give them, there's a lot of options, and we just give them as much as we can, and they can pick and choose.
Now you mentioned SANE, which is always a nice acronym, but it stands for?
Sexual Assault Nurse Examiners.
And so that would be an option. And what is the Sexual Assault Nurse Examiner component?
Yeah, so for the exam for sexual assault nurse examiner, there's always an advocate there from the Rape Crisis Center. So we collaborate really closely with each other. So pretty much they have a couple of options if they do decide to do an exam. They can do evidence collection. They can take pictures of any injuries. They give them STD medication for the 3 most common STIs in Albuquerque, which is trichomonas, gonorrhea, and chlamydia. They can give them Plan B, they can check for pregnancy, they can just do a wellness exam, and for evidence collection it has to be within 5 days, but they can always go if they just want to do a general wellness exam.
And you mentioned Plan B, and sometimes people want to think that that's an abortion pill, but it's not. You want to tell me how Plan B works and the idea behind it, and especially when we're looking at a rape?
So again, I'm not a medical provider,
Right.
so I can just give you the general idea. But we do, or SANE actually provides Plan B, because with a sexual assault, I mean, someone who's exerting power and control over a person doesn't always use a condom or isn't safe. So we give them Plan B as a preventative to not get pregnant after an assault. So pretty much, Plan B is not an abortion pill. So if someone's pregnant, it doesn't cause an abortion, or just, it's not an abortion pill. Pretty much how it works is that it prevents the lining or the eggs to attach to the lining of the uterus,
Right.
so people can't get pregnant. So it's not that it kills an egg or something like that, but it just prevents it from sticking to the lining of the uterus, which could cause a pregnancy.
And that's an option for someone who has just been raped and may sit there and go, the last thing I need to do is be pregnant by this traumatic component.
Yeah.
And when we talk about SANE and we talk about those kits, that brings something that has been up in the news, and not only our state, but many states,
Yeah.
of a backlog of the sexual assault nurse examiner kits, which is actually the kit where all of the evidence is collected. And there is this backlog here in the state of New Mexico. And I know there's some progress, but maybe you could kind of update us on what is occurring with that and what's going on with that.
Well, there are many of the labs throughout the state, including in the city, are now receiving additional funds so that they can hire the personnel necessary to process these kits. And so there's a prioritization process in place, to determine, which kits need to be processed when. And that's moving forward. The problem is that once you hire someone, there's a 6-month to 18-month training period before that individual working in a forensics lab is really at a point where they can work independently on their own, to in fact process a rape test kit. But like I said, it's a slow, steady kind of progress that's happening. There's still so much that has to be done, and so when I talk about prioritization, for example, the city council here just earlier this year passed a new law saying that new kits would have to be tested within a 90-day, processed within a 90-day period. And so trying to get the police department, the district attorney, and anyone else who's touching those kits, to number them, to include all the information that's necessary so that it does get treated as a priority case, is a training process that we're still working on now. We've been Rape Crisis Center and SANE have been mandated to sort of lead this new group called ACERT, which has to do with the rape kits. And our responsibility is to oversee, the enactment of this new law to make certain that everything is happening. Police department here just got how much money? Just got
A bunch.
A lot of money. I think it was like $4 million or something like that. And of course, they want to put it all into facilitating the processing of these kits. But we're saying, but there are other pieces of that component that have to be in place. How do you do victim notification? Who's going to do victim notification? Where does the training come in? And they're looking to Rape Crisis Center to develop a training program for everybody that's going to be involved in victim notification. So how do you do all of that? And how much of this money is going to be, let loose from the police department so that we can in fact have a well-rounded approach, to this problem.
And those things are huge because when we look at a backlog, people it may have been a couple of years, more than a couple of years, and having that come up and someone now contacting them when they're like giving up It's like nothing is going to be done. I think Albuquerque and the surrounding area that the rape crisis serves is lucky because they have a hotline and they have services available. But when you look at rural areas, tribal areas, that's not necessarily the case. And so you see cases from different tribes, nations, pueblos, from around the state because those services are not available in certain areas. And so the advantage is that in Albuquerque there are those services. The disadvantage and the unfortunate piece is not having those services available around our state. So it's still something that we can improve as a state itself.
Well, it's about relationship building and gaining trust in communities and then providing them with the tools that are necessary for them to be able to feel comfortable having these kinds of discussions in an open forum. Now when it comes to the pueblos, you know better than I do. It's hard to get into a lot of them, and rightly so. Because there's a lot of reasons to distrust anybody who is not a native.
Outside community.
Outside, yeah, it's hard. But, we're beginning to break down those barriers as well. Our prevention education team just got an invitation to come to one of the pueblos and do a presentation. That's a start. So we've got to do that, and we've got to just take them on one by one and build that kind of trust and open up those lines of communication and keep them open. But the other part of it, has to do with the conversation, and getting people to a point, particularly communities of color, require very different approaches in most cases to how you talk about these things. As an African American, for example, the African American community, as small as it may be, needs to have this conversation. And they need to have it every day, throughout New Mexico and throughout the country, as far as I'm concerned. And yet we don't. So we need to find ways that we can come through the back door through other kinds of partnerships with agencies and have them agree to sponsor forums, as a way to start having these kinds of discussions, and then get people out and let them know, hey, you can talk about this. Not only can you talk about it, you need to talk about it because it's happening right under your nose.
And one thing that I really appreciate about rape crisis and the way it's forming under your direction is having a multicultural staff and having that piece, and having different communities represented so that they can outreach appropriately, because I think there's a big difference between outreach and outreaching with communities with culture and doing it in an appropriate and respectful way. So I do appreciate that, and I want to acknowledge that.
So necessary.
If I'm a community member and I'm watching this now, or I'm a sister or a brother of someone who's walked through that, as a community member, what are the things that I could do to support or just be a good, balanced member of my community around sexual violence issues?
If you've got the time, come and volunteer. That's one. If you have relationships with other organizations in your respective communities, then serve as a bridge. Bring us to those organizations, so that we can, in fact, begin to open up this dialogue. But there's so many ways that we make it possible for you to learn, first of all. You can learn the key words and phrases. You can learn the things that clearly define what sexual harassment is, what sexual violence is, what we mean when we say consent is our culture. We all those things need to begin to come together. And so if you are part of a community and you recognize an opportunity to get a discussion going, then we'll help you with that. And we'll be there with you every step of the way.
And believe and respect. And the no means no, as well as the yes means yes, too, is the idea is that having a healthy discussion around sex, being and knowing about sexual components is also going to lead you to know what is unhealthy and understanding, what shouldn't be done and how you shouldn't be touched and what the respect is. When we're looking at all of these components, the piece that most strikes me is, as an individual, making sure that we believe and making sure that sexual harassment doesn't go on in a little dome all by itself. The guard that you talked about is someone who says, this is wrong, and I want to let you know this is wrong. That's the kind of speaking up and saying no, and a joke and a boys will be boys should not be permitted in our world, in our community, in our city, in our homes. When you were going to give final words in your community, what would your final words be to your community and what you could let them know?
So, para la gente que habla español, que es hispana, latina, estamos aquí para apoyar y dar apoyo y información. No están solos, no es su culpa si fueron lastimados. Pueden llamarnos al 505-266-7711 las 24 horas al día, 7 días a la semana. No importa lo que estén usando, la ropa que usen, lo que estén haciendo, pueden tomar, pueden hacer lo que quieran. La gente no tiene el derecho de lastimarlas. Ustedes tienen el derecho de ser apoyados y aquí tienen un apoyo siempre. And pretty much people should be able to walk down the street and drink whatever they want to drink and wear whatever they want to wear and not be scared that they're going to be sexually assaulted. I mean, someone can walk down the street naked and that doesn't give people the right to hurt them.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. And Jim, when you're looking at final thoughts as well as the direction that the Rape Crisis Center is going.
You mentioned at the top about partnerships. And I think that this is the way that we need to go, and that is every opportunity we have to form new partnerships where we can establish a presence to assist whatever is happening there, be it the YMCA, the YWCA, the Boys and Girls Clubs, youth service agencies, wherever it is, if we can create a partnership and establish a presence, that's where I want to go. Because that's the way we're going to keep this discussion open and going. And people begin to realize, that, we believe, we are believed, and this is a safe space. And that it's just the way we need to do this. We need to expand our community and open it up and have this discussion every day.
And we've just talked about a couple of things that Rape Crisis Center can do, but they can call you, they can have a conversation with you, they can invite you to their organizations. But most of all, what we want to do is just remind people that sexual violence is not about sex, it's not about lust, it's about violence and it's about power. If you are, and if you have had this trauma happen to you, and you're a survivor, a victim of sexual violence, know that there are people out there who care. Know that no matter what, this is not your fault. There are people out there, like Rape Crisis of Central New Mexico, that are there to listen, but there are people out there who know that this was not your fault. Know that you're not alone. And when you are a survivor, that's one of the things that you feel most, is that I am alone. And you are not alone. Unfortunately, this has happened to a lot of people, but we want you to know we care. We believe you, and it's not your fault. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being open to hearing about this topic. Thank you very much.